The wind howled a cold, lonely song across the vast, white plains of Colorado in 1880. It was a song Silas knew well, a melody that had been his constant companion for most of the year. He was a man of the wild, a hunter whose days were spent tracking deer and trapping beaver, far from the laughter and chatter of people. His home was a small cabin, hidden deep in the snowy mountains, where the only sounds were the whisper of pines and the crunch of his own boots on frozen earth. For Silas, silence was not just a part of his life, it was his whole world. But even the loneliest wolf sometimes needed to venture from its den. As the deepest part of winter arrived, bringing with it a chill that seeped into the very bones, Silas knew it was time. He had a stack of soft, warm pelts piled high, ready for trade. His old, battered pack was heavy with them, each one a testament to his skill and patience. This yearly trip was a ritual as old as the snows themselves. It was his only connection to the world beyond his cabin walls, a necessary journey to exchange his hard work for the few things he needed to survive another long season. More than just flour and bullets, Silas sought something else in town, something that would warm him from the inside out, something that would quiet the restless thoughts that sometimes crept in during the long, dark nights. He thought of the amber liquid that glowed in bottles behind the saloon bar, promising a brief escape from the cold grip of solitude. It was a promise he looked forward to, a small comfort in a life that offered few. His breath plumed out in frosty clouds as he tramped through the deep snow, the only human figure for miles. The journey was long and hard, but the thought of the bustling town, even with its unfamiliar faces and loud noises, held a strange pull. Soon, the distant haze of smoke from chimneys would appear, followed by the faint sounds of life, a dog barking, a blacksmith hammer, the distant ring of a bell. For a man who spoke to no one for months, these small signs of civilization were a beacon, drawing him closer to the temporary warmth he sought before retreating once more into his quiet, solitary world. The scent of wood smoke and hot food grew stronger as Silas finally reached the edge of town. His boots, heavy with snow, crunched on the packed street. He could hear the distant jingle of a piano and the rumble of voices, a stark contrast to the vast silence of his mountain home. He walked past the general store, past the blacksmith's forge, his eyes fixed on one particular building, the saloon. Its swinging doors seemed to beckon him, a warm, glowing promise in the dim light of late afternoon. Inside, the air was thick with warmth and the smell of stale beer and sawdust. Men sat at small tables, their laughter echoing against the wooden walls. Silas, tall and broad-shouldered, moved with a quiet grace born of years in the wilderness. His eyes, usually sharp and watchful in the forest, now held a weary look, a longing for the comfort he knew this place offered. He walked straight to the long, polished bar, dropping his heavy pack of pelts with a soft thud onto the floor beside him. The barkeeper, a burly man with a thick mustache, nodded a greeting. "The usual, Silas?" the man asked, already reaching for a bottle. Silas just grunted in agreement. He didn't need to speak much. His routine was well known here. After months of tracking and trapping, of battling the cold and the endless quiet, a strong drink was a reward. It was a way to shake off the chill that had settled deep in his bones, not just from the weather, but from the loneliness. He pictured the amber liquid warming his throat, easing the tension in his shoulders, and quieting the thoughts that often spun in his head like trapped birds. He pulled a few silver coins from his worn leather pouch. Their metallic gleamed dull in the saloon's low light. He pushed them across the bar, his gaze fixed on the bottle the barkeeper was now pouring. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the crackle of the fire in the hearth, it all washed over him, a comforting wave of noise after his long journey. He yearned for the bite of the liquor, the way it settled into his empty spaces, making the world seem a little less cold, a little less lonely. It was his yearly ritual, his winter solace, and he looked forward to it with a quiet, powerful need. Silas watched as the barkeeper reached for the familiar bottle, a small sigh of relief almost escaping him. But then a soft voice cut through the saloon's din. "Just a moment, Hank." Silas turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon a woman he hadn't noticed before. She stood behind the bar, a simple apron tied over her dark dress. Her hair, the color of rich earth, was pulled back neatly, and her eyes, a warm hazel, held a quiet strength. This was Alara, the saloon keeper, though Silas rarely saw her in person. She usually kept to the back rooms. She was a widow, people said, who had taken over the business after her husband passed. Silas knew little else, and cared less, focused only on his drink. Alara stepped forward, her hands neat and capable. She didn't look at Silas with judgment, but with a steady, calm expression. "Silas," she said, her voice clear and gentle, yet firm. "I appreciate your business, but I won't be serving you liquor today." Silas blinked. He hadn't heard those words from a saloon keeper in all his years. He frowned, his brow furrowing under his thick, snow-dusted hair. He pushed the silver coins further across the bar. "My money's good," he rumbled, his voice rough from disuse. Alara didn't touch the coins. She simply shook her head. "I know it is, Silas, but some things are worth more than money. I've seen you come in every winter. You spend your hard-earned money on something that doesn't truly help you." Her words were kind, not accusing, but they still struck Silas with surprise. He felt a flicker of annoyance, a strange warmth rising in his cheeks. No one had ever spoken to him like this. He started to argue, to demand his usual drink, but Alara held up a hand, a small, polite gesture that stopped his words. Instead, she continued, her gaze unwavering. "I'd like to offer you something else. On the house." She gestured toward a steaming pot on a small stove behind her. "A cup of hot coffee. It's fresh, and it'll warm you just as well as any whiskey, without the sting." Silas stared at her, then at the pot, then back at his coins. The offer was so unexpected, so completely outside his winter ritual, that he didn't quite know how to react. He had come for his usual comfort, his usual escape. Now, this woman was offering something entirely different, something he hadn't asked for, and certainly hadn't expected. Silas stood at the bar, his hand still resting near the rejected coins, a mix of confusion and irritation clouding his face. He had come here for a specific purpose, a well-worn path in his solitary life, and this woman was blocking it. He was used to the straightforward ways of the wild, where a trap was a trap and a pelt was a pelt. This gentle refusal, this offer of something else, felt like a tangled snare. "Coffee," he grumbled, the word tasting strange on his tongue. It wasn't what he wanted. It wasn't the fiery warmth that numbed the edges of his loneliness. It was just coffee. Alara smiled softly, a small, knowing look in her hazel eyes. She didn't push or argue. She simply poured a steaming mug from the pot, the rich, dark smell of it filling the air. She placed it on the bar in front of him, a simple white ceramic cup. "It's good and strong, Silas," she said, her voice still kind. "No charge." Silas stared at the cup. It felt too warm, too ordinary. He wanted the familiar sting of whiskey, the quick rush that silenced the echoes in his mind. But Alara stood there, patient and unwavering, her gaze steady. He knew he couldn't force her. He could leave, of course, find another saloon, but the thought of packing up his pelts and wandering further felt like too much effort after his long trek. Besides, there was something in Alara's eyes that made him pause, a quiet insistence that wasn't rude, but simply resolute. With a grunt that was more sigh than protest, Silas slowly picked up the mug. The warmth seeped into his cold fingers, a sensation he hadn't realized he missed. He brought it to his lips, taking a cautious sip. It was bitter, strong, and surprisingly good. It wasn't the fiery burn he expected, but a different kind of warmth, one that spread slowly through his chest. He still felt a prickle of annoyance at having his routine broken, at being told what he wouldn't be served, but beneath that, a tiny seed of something else began to stir, a hint of curiosity, a flicker of grudging acceptance. This was new, and for a man who lived by old ways, new was a rare and unsettling thing. The steam from the coffee rose, tickling Silas's nose. He took another slow sip, the warmth a steady comfort against the chill he still carried from mountains. He kept his gaze on the mug, avoiding Alara's eyes, unsure how to act. He was a man of few words, especially with strangers, and this situation was far from his usual silent transactions. Alara, however, seemed to understand. She didn't press him for conversation. Instead, she quietly polished a glass, her movements calm and easy. The saloon around them hummed with the usual afternoon chatter, but at their small part of the bar, a different kind of quiet settled, one not of loneliness, but of shared space. After a few moments, Alara spoke, her voice soft. "Long trek from the mountains, Silas." Silas grunted a short, rough sound. "Always is." He didn't offer more, but he didn't turn away either. He took another sip of coffee, feeling the heat spread through him. "The snows were heavy this year," she observed, not asking, but simply stating a fact. "Must have been hard to get through." "Hard enough," Silas replied, his eyes finally lifting to meet hers for a brief moment. He saw no judgment there, only a calm, watchful look. It was a look that didn't demand answers, but seemed to offer a quiet understanding. He felt a strange pull, a small urge to say more, but the words felt stuck in his throat and used to being formed. They fell into silence again, but it wasn't the empty silence of his cabin. This was a silence filled with unspoken things. Alara watched him, not staring, but with a gentle curiosity. Silas, in turn, found his eyes drifting to her. He noticed the faint lines around her eyes, signs of worry or laughter he couldn't guess. He wondered about her life, running this noisy place alone. He wondered why she had offered him coffee, why she had cared enough to stop him. The coffee mug grew lighter as he drank, and the silence between them grew less awkward, more like a comfortable space. They were two quiet people, sharing a moment in a busy room, each wondering about the other, a tiny thread of connection beginning to weave between them. Silas stayed longer that first day than he had intended, lingering over his coffee, drawn by the unusual quiet Alara offered. When he finally left, the town felt a little less cold, and the path back to his temporary room felt a little less lonely. The next day, after trading his pelts at the general store, he found himself walking towards the saloon again, not for liquor, but for the coffee, and for the quiet woman behind the bar. Over the next few weeks, as winter deepened and Silas remained in town for his annual resupply, this new routine became a gentle rhythm. He would come to the saloon, sometimes after a long day, sometimes just for a morning cup. Alara would greet him with a soft nod, and soon the coffee would be waiting. Their conversations grew, slowly, like the thaw after a hard frost. At first, Silas would only offer short answers, grunts and nods. But Alara was patient. She talked about the changing weather, the needs of the town, small, everyday things. She never pushed him, never pried, but her words were like warm stones, slowly heating the cold, hard shell around his heart. One afternoon, as a blizzard raged outside, trapping everyone indoors, Silas found himself telling her about a particularly clever fox he'd almost caught. He described the way it moved, the cunning in its eyes, a story he hadn't shared with another soul. Alara listened, her hazel eyes fixed on him, a small smile playing on her lips. "He sounds like a smart one," she'd said, making Silas feel seen, truly heard, for the first time in a very long time. In return, Alara shared bits of her own life. She spoke of her late husband, a kind man who had taught her the saloon business, and of the challenges of running it alone. She spoke of her hopes for the town, of wishing for a school for the few children who lived there. Silas, who rarely thought beyond his next hunt, found himself listening, imagining these things, picturing her life. Through these simple, honest exchanges, a gentle connection began to form. It wasn't a sudden, bright spark, but a steady, growing warmth, like embers glowing brighter in the hearth. The saloon, once just a place for liquor, was becoming something more, a place where Silas could find a different kind of comfort and where the silence between two people could speak volumes. The snow continued to fall in Colorado, painting the world in shades of white and gray. But for Silas, something inside him was changing. His daily trips to the saloon, once a mere necessity for supplies and a brief escape, now held a different kind of meaning. He found himself waking with a new thought, not just about the weather or his next task, but about his visit to Alara. He still came to trade his pelts and buy his necessities, but the core of his winter visit had shifted. The strong, dark coffee Alara offered was no longer just a substitute. It was a comfort he genuinely looked forward to. More than the coffee itself, it was the quiet talks, the shared moments of understanding that truly drew him. He realized, with a surprising clarity, that the warmth he found in Alara's presence and their conversations was deeper and more lasting than the fleeting heat of any liquor. Silas noticed how the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease when he sat at her bar, how the constant, low hum of loneliness that usually followed him everywhere seemed to quiet down. He found himself smiling more, small, rare smiles that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He even started to remember small details from their talks, like Alara's favorite type of flower or a funny story she told about a mischievous town dog. These little pieces of shared life felt precious, like tiny, glowing stones he collected in his mind. He still didn't speak much, but his silence with Alara felt different. It was a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken trust. He found he could simply be in her presence, without the need to impress or pretend. He no longer yearned for the bite of the whiskey to dull his thoughts. Instead, Alara's gentle words and steady gaze brought a different kind of peace. It was a comfort that didn't fade with the last sip, but stayed with him, a quiet warmth against the winter's chill. He was finding a new kind of solace, a connection that was slowly, tenderly, thawing the ice around his long, isolated heart. As the weeks turned into a deeper winter, Silas found himself sharing more than just stories of the hunt. One blustery afternoon, after a particularly long silence, Alara asked, "What brought you to the mountains, Silas? Such a lonely life." Silas hesitated, his gaze drifting to the frost-patterned window. He hadn't spoken of this to anyone in years, not since he had first sought the quiet solitude of the peaks. But Alara's question wasn't prying. It was soft, gentle, and held a genuine curiosity that made him feel safe enough to answer. "Lost my family," he rumbled, the words rough from disuse, like stones tumbling down a mountainside. "Fever. Took 'em both, my wife and my little girl. Town life, too many memories." He didn't elaborate, but the raw pain in his voice, even after all this time, was clear. He had sought the wilderness not just for its quiet, but for its emptiness, a place where the echoes of laughter and love couldn't reach him. Alara listened, her hands still for once. Her own eyes, usually so steady, softened with a deep understanding. She knew what it was to lose loved ones, to feel the sharp edge of grief. She had carried her own sorrow since her husband's passing, finding comfort in work and in the small kindnesses she offered. She saw in Silas's stoic face not just a hunter, but a man broken by loss, a man who had chosen isolation as a shield against further pain. "I'm so sorry, Silas," she said quietly, her voice full of true sympathy. "That's a heavy burden to carry alone." She didn't offer empty platitudes or try to fix his pain. She simply acknowledged it, letting him know she understood, at least in part, what he carried. Silas looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Few people had ever offered him such simple, honest understanding. Most just looked away or offered clumsy words. But Alara's gaze was steady, accepting. In that moment, he felt a knot in his chest, a tight coil of old grief, loosen just a fraction. He realized she saw past the gruff hunter, past the reclusive man, to the pain that had driven him to the wild. And in her seeing, he felt a tiny bit less alone. After sharing his painful past with Alara, Silas felt a subtle shift within him. The heavy cloak of his grief, usually so suffocating, seemed to lift a little, allowing a sliver of light to peek through. He began to see the town not just as a place to resupply, but as a place that held warmth, a place where kindness could exist. He started noticing the small things, the cheerful chatter of children playing in the snow outside the general store, the friendly wave from the blacksmith, the inviting glow of lamplight from the windows of homes as dusk fell. These were details he had ignored for years, dismissing them as the noise of a world he no longer belonged to. Now, they seemed less like noise and more like a gentle hum of life. But the brightest spot, the true hearth of this newfound warmth, was Alara's company. Her quiet strength, her steady gaze, and her genuine understanding were a stark contrast to the stark solitude of his cabin. In the mountains, he faced nature's harsh beauty alone. Here, in the saloon, he found a different kind of beauty, human connection. He would sit at the bar, sipping his coffee, listening to Alara talk about her day, or simply watching her move with grace and purpose. He found himself thinking about her when he was away, wondering about her thoughts, her feelings. He started to realize that the comfort he had once sought in the bottle was a poor imitation of the true warmth he felt in her presence. Liquor offered a temporary forgetting, a numb escape. Alara offered something real, something that made him feel alive, even if it also meant feeling the old aches of his past. The silence in his cabin, once a welcome refuge, now sometimes felt too vast, too empty. He started to anticipate his visits to town, not with the grim determination of a man facing a chore, but with a quiet eagerness. The town, and especially Alara, was slowly becoming a beacon, pulling him out of his self-imposed darkness, showing him that warmth and connection were still possible, even for a man who thought he had lost everything. He was beginning to see that true comfort wasn't found in hiding from the world, but in finding a small, bright corner within it. As the days grew longer and the grip of winter slowly loosened, a significant change began to take root in Silas's habits. He still visited the general store for supplies, and he still went to the saloon, but the reason for his visit had completely shifted. The bottles of whiskey that had once been his main draw now held less appeal. The sharp, burning comfort they offered felt shallow compared to the quiet, steady warmth he found in Alara's company. He started to drink less, much less. Instead of asking for a shot, he would simply nod toward the coffee pot. Alara, with her gentle smile, would pour him a fresh cup, and their conversations would begin. He found himself eager for these talks, for the moments of shared silence and soft words. He would linger, sometimes for hours, listening to her, sharing small observations about the changing seasons in the mountains, or asking about the town's happenings. The longing for alcohol, which had been a constant companion in his isolated winters, began to fade. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic disappearance, but a slow, quiet lessening, like snow melting under a warm sun. He realized that the liquor had only ever offered a temporary escape, a numbing that kept his pain at bay, but never truly healed it. Alara, however, offered something different. She offered presence, understanding, and a connection that made the world feel less daunting, his grief less crushing. He found solace in her kind eyes, in the way she listened without judgment, in the simple act of sharing a quiet moment. He discovered that true comfort wasn't in forgetting, but in being seen and understood. The talks with Alara were like a balm to his soul, soothing the raw edges of his loneliness in a way alcohol never could. His old habit of seeking oblivion was slowly being replaced by a new desire for connection, a thirst for genuine human warmth that was far more satisfying than any drink. He was little by little choosing life and connection over escape. The winter was nearing its end. Patches of brown earth began to show through the melting snow, and the air held the crisp promise of spring. Silas's time in town was drawing to a close, and soon he would return to his cabin. But this year, the thought of going back to the mountains didn't fill him with the familiar dread of isolation. Instead, he felt a quiet strength, a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. One afternoon, he walked into the saloon, his gaze steady. He carried his usual pack, but also something else, something small and heavy tucked in his belt. Alara was behind the bar, polishing glasses as usual. She looked up, her eyes lighting up with her usual warm greeting. "Good to see you, Silas," she said, already reaching for the coffee pot. Silas nodded, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. He placed his pack down, then slowly, deliberately pulled out the item from his belt. It was a bottle half filled with amber liquid, the very last one he owned. It was the same brand he used to ask for, the one that promised forgetfulness. It was a relic of his past, a symbol of his long struggle with grief and loneliness. He set it gently on the bar between them, not with a flourish, but with a quiet resolve. Alara's hand paused in its polishing. Her gaze fell upon the bottle, then lifted to Silas's face, a question in her eyes. "This is it," Silas said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it, but firm. "My last one." He looked at the bottle, then at Alara, a lifetime of solitary winters, of unspoken pain, and now, of newfound hope reflected in his eyes. It was a silent offering, a physical representation of the turning point he had reached, a testament to the change she had helped bring about in him. He wasn't asking for a drink. He was showing her he was choosing a different path. Alara looked at the half-full bottle, then at Silas. She didn't speak, but her eyes held a warmth that spoke volumes. It was a look of understanding, of quiet pride, and of shared hope. Silas met her gaze, and in that moment, he felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The heavy weight of his past, the constant pull of his old habits, seemed to lift from his shoulders. He picked up the bottle from the bar. It felt surprisingly light in his hand, no longer holding the power it once did. He walked towards the saloon doors, Alara watching him with a gentle smile. The other patrons, lost in their own conversations, barely noticed. Silas pushed open the swinging doors and stepped out into the crisp, late winter air. Outside, the snow was still deep in places, though patches of bare earth showed through. The sun, pale but promising, cast long shadows. Silas stood for a moment, breathing in the cold, clean air. He looked at the bottle in his hand, then at the world around him. He saw the bustling street, the children playing, the smoke curling from chimneys, signs of life, of connection, of a future he was now ready to embrace. With a deep breath, Silas tilted the bottle. The amber liquid, his old comfort and his old enemy, poured out in a steady stream, splashing onto the pristine white snow. It soaked into the frozen ground, leaving a dark, temporary stain before disappearing, melting away like the last vestiges of winter. It was a silent act, but one filled with immense meaning. Each drop that fell was a release, a letting go of the pain he had tried to drown, the loneliness he had tried to numb. When the bottle was empty, Silas held it up, turning it over to make sure no lingering drops remained. He then placed the empty bottle carefully into his pack, not as a reminder of failure, but as a symbol of a battle won, a journey completed. He looked back at the saloon doors. Alara stood there, watching him, her smile wide and genuine. Silas returned her smile, a broad, free smile that reached his eyes. He was choosing a new path, a future not of isolation and hidden pain, but of connection and hope. He was choosing to live, truly live, in the warmth of the world and in the comfort of a friendship that had shown him the way home.